Hello, we are so excited to show you our native speech capabilities. Welcome back to the English journey. Today, we are discussing a modern epidemic that is stealing our focus, brain rot. My name is Anna, and I am here to guide you through how hobbies are your best defense against passive consumption.
And I am Abel. I am so glad to be here with you, Anna. We spend so much of our time scrolling through mindless content, feeling tired, but not actually relaxed. Today, we want to talk about how picking up a real hobby can reclaim your brain and make you a better English learner.
That is a perfect way to begin, Abel. And I want to start by saying something that might surprise some of our listeners. Brain rot is not a medical diagnosis. It is not something a doctor will write on a piece of paper for you, but it is something that millions and millions of people feel every single day. They feel mentally foggy. They feel tired even after a full night of sleep. They feel like they cannot focus on a single task for longer than a few minutes without reaching for their phone. Does that sound familiar to you, Abel?
It sounds extremely familiar, Anna. I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, but there were periods in my life where I would wake up in the morning and literally, before I even got out of bed, before I even had a glass of water, I would open my phone and start scrolling. And I would scroll through short videos, through social media feeds, through comment sections for sometimes 45 minutes or even an hour. And then I would get up, make my coffee, and feel absolutely exhausted. I had not done a single productive thing, but my brain felt completely drained.
And that experience you're describing is so important, Abel, because it captures exactly what brain rot feels like from the inside. You have consumed enormous amounts of information and stimulation, but none of it was meaningful. None of it required anything from you. You did not have to think, you did not have to respond, you did not have to create. You simply received and received and received, like a vessel being filled with water that immediately evaporates. And that's the core difference between what researchers and educators call passive consumption and active creation.
Can you explain that difference a little more, Anna? Because I think when most people hear the words passive and active, they might think of, lying down versus exercising. But I feel like it goes much deeper than that.
It does go so much deeper. So let us think about this carefully. Passive consumption means that you are receiving content without any mental effort or engagement on your part. The algorithm, which is the computer system that decides what you see on social media platforms, has been designed by some of the most intelligent engineers in the world, and their entire goal is to make you stay on the platform for as long as possible. They study what makes your eyes stop scrolling. They study what makes you feel a tiny spark of emotion, whether that's excitement or laughter or outrage or sadness, and they deliver that to you in a perfectly timed sequence so that you never have a moment of quiet. You never have a moment where your brain says, "Okay, I've had enough stimulation now. I would like to rest." The algorithm does not allow for rest. It simply gives you the next thing.
That is actually a little frightening when you say it out loud like that, because I never really thought about it as a design. I always thought, well, I'm just choosing to scroll. I'm choosing to watch this video. But you're saying that the choice is actually being made for me in a way.
Exactly. And this is where the neuroscience becomes incredibly interesting. When you're scrolling through a feed of short videos, each new video delivers what neuroscientists call a dopamine hit. Dopamine is a chemical in your brain. It's often called the pleasure chemical, but that's actually a slight oversimplification. Dopamine is more accurately described as the anticipation chemical. It's the chemical that your brain releases when it expects a reward. So when you're scrolling and you don't know what the next video will be, your brain is constantly releasing small amounts of dopamine in anticipation. And then the video appears, and it's funny or surprising, and you get a small reward. And then immediately you scroll to the next one, and the anticipation begins again.
So it's like a slot machine. That's the comparison I've heard before. Your brain is always expecting the next big reward, and sometimes it comes, and sometimes it doesn't, but the expectation itself is what keeps you pulling the lever.
That's a perfect analogy, Abel. Casinos actually spent decades studying this exact psychological mechanism. The unpredictability of the reward is what makes it so addictive. If every pull of the slot machine gave you money, it would actually not be as compelling. It's the randomness, the not knowing, that keeps people engaged. And social media platforms have essentially applied this same principle to content. You don't know if the next video will be the one that makes you truly laugh out loud, or the one that shocks you, or the one that teaches you something incredible. So you keep scrolling, and your brain keeps releasing dopamine, and you keep going.
So then what happens to the brain after hours and hours of this? Because I can tell you from my own experience, it does not feel good afterward. It feels almost like a hangover, like I've indulged in something and now I'm paying for it.
That description of a hangover is actually very accurate from a neurological perspective. What happens is this: your brain has a limited capacity for dopamine production. When you spend hours and hours triggering tiny dopamine releases through scrolling, you're essentially draining that supply. And your brain, as a protective mechanism, begins to reduce its sensitivity to dopamine. This is called down regulation. Your brain is saying, we have been stimulated too much, so I'm going to lower the threshold for what counts as pleasurable. And the result is that ordinary life without the constant stimulation of a screen, begins to feel incredibly boring and flat and meaningless. Things that used to bring you joy, like going for a walk, or having a conversation with a friend, or reading a book, suddenly feel almost unbearable in their slowness.
Oh, that's so relatable. I remember a period where I tried to read a book, a novel I'd been excited about for months, and I genuinely couldn't get through a single page without reaching for my phone. I would read one paragraph and then feel this almost physical urge to check something, anything on my phone. And I thought at the time that something was wrong with me personally. But what you're describing makes me think this was actually a neurological response to too much passive stimulation.
That is exactly what it was. And I want to be very clear to our listeners. There is nothing wrong with you if you have experienced this. This is not a character flaw. This is not laziness. This is your brain responding in a completely predictable way to an environment that was specifically engineered to exploit your brain's reward system. The people who design these platforms are not evil, but their business model depends on your engagement, and they have become extraordinarily good at capturing it. Understanding this is the first step toward doing something about it.
So let us talk about what we can actually do about it. Because I think a lot of people at this point in a conversation like this would feel a little hopeless. They would think, well, if these platforms are designed by brilliant engineers to capture my attention, what chance do I have? I am just one person.
And that is exactly the right question to ask. And the answer is both simpler and more profound than most people expect. The answer is a hobby, a real, active, creative, or skill-based hobby. And I want to explain why, on a neurological level, this is so powerful. When you engage in an activity that requires your full attention, that requires you to learn something, to make decisions, to practice, to fail, and to try again, your brain begins to do something extraordinary. It starts building new neural connections. This process is called neuroplasticity, and it is one of the most exciting discoveries in modern neuroscience.
Neuroplasticity. Can you break that word down for our listeners? Because it is a wonderful word, but maybe an intimidating one.
Of course. Neuro refers to the neurons in your brain, which are the cells that carry information. Plasticity means the ability to change shape, to be molded like plastic. So neuroplasticity simply means the brain's ability to change and reorganize itself. For a long time, scientists believed that the brain was essentially fixed after childhood, that whatever neural pathways you had developed by the time you were an adult were the pathways you would have for life. But we now know that this is completely wrong. The brain retains its plasticity throughout your entire life. It can form new connections, strengthen existing ones, and even create entirely new pathways in response to new experiences and challenges.
So a hobby is a new experience and a new challenge.
Precisely. Think about learning to play the guitar. When you first pick up a guitar, your fingers do not know where to go. Your brain has no map for this activity. You have to look at your fingers, count the strings, press down in exactly the right place, and strum at exactly the right moment. It is genuinely difficult. It can be frustrating. Some people give up at this stage, which is completely understandable. But something remarkable is happening underneath that frustration. Your brain is working intensely. It's building new neural pathways to coordinate your fingers, to process the sounds you're making, to compare what you are hearing to what you want to hear. Every single practice session is literally reshaping your brain.
And this is the opposite of scrolling, which requires no effort and builds no new pathways.
Exactly. Scrolling does not challenge your brain. It does not ask anything difficult of you. It simply delivers pre-packaged stimulation. And a brain that is never challenged is a brain that slowly loses its capacity for deep, sustained focus. This is what many researchers now believe is at the heart of the brain rot experience. It is not just that you feel foggy and distracted, it's that your brain's capacity for attention is genuinely being weakened by lack of use, in the same way that a muscle weakens when it is not exercised.
That is such a clear way to put it. Your attention is a muscle, and scrolling is the equivalent of lying on the couch all day. You wouldn't expect to be able to run a marathon after months of no physical exercise, so why would you expect to be able to focus deeply after months of passive consumption?
That is beautifully said, Abel. And I want to extend that metaphor a little further because I think it helps explain why hobbies feel difficult at first. When you start exercising after a long period of inactivity, the first few sessions are genuinely painful. Your muscles ache, you feel out of breath. You might feel embarrassed that you cannot do as much as you used to. But you also know, because you understand how the body works, that this difficulty is the process. The soreness is proof that your muscles are adapting. The breathlessness is proof that your cardiovascular system is responding. The difficulty is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that you are growing.
And the same is true for a hobby. The first time you sit down to learn something new, whether that's knitting or cooking a complex dish or learning English, it feels hard. It feels uncomfortable. And a brain that is addicted to easy dopamine hits is going to scream at you to stop and go back to the scroll.
Yes, and this is what I call the discomfort gap. The gap between the easy, immediate pleasure of passive consumption and the slow, building satisfaction of active creation. Crossing that gap is hard, but what waits on the other side is something that social media genuinely cannot provide. A sense of competence, of mastery, of genuine pride in something you have built with your own effort.
Let us talk more about that dopamine aspect, because I think people often hear that social media gives you dopamine hits and conclude that you should just try to want less dopamine, but that's not really the point, is it?
No, and this is a very important distinction. Dopamine itself is not the enemy. Dopamine is essential. It's the chemical that motivates you to pursue goals, to feel satisfied, to experience pleasure. The problem is not dopamine. The problem is the source of the dopamine. There's a profound difference between what researchers call fast dopamine and slow dopamine. Fast dopamine comes from quick, easy rewards, a funny video, a like on your post, a new notification. It arrives quickly, it feels good momentarily, and then it fades just as quickly, leaving you wanting more. It's like eating a piece of candy. It tastes sweet, but it doesn't satisfy your hunger.
And slow dopamine.
Slow dopamine comes from activities that take sustained effort and time. When you practice a skill over weeks and months, when you finally cook a dish that comes out perfectly, when you finally understand a grammatical concept that confused you for a long time, your brain releases a much deeper, more sustained wave of dopamine. It is not a quick spike. It is a warm, satisfying feeling of genuine accomplishment. And crucially, this type of dopamine does not leave you wanting more in an anxious, addicted way. It leaves you feeling genuinely fulfilled. It leaves you feeling like your time was well spent.
I actually experienced a version of this recently. I have been learning to cook, and last week I made a proper soup, completely from scratch. I chopped all the vegetables, I made my own stock, I seasoned it carefully, tasted it throughout the process, and when I sat down and ate it, I felt this enormous sense of satisfaction that I genuinely do not feel after an hour of scrolling. I felt proud. I felt like I had done something real.
That experience you just described is so valuable, Abel, and I want to explore it a little more because cooking is actually one of the most perfect hobbies for someone recovering from brain rot, and I want to explain why. Cooking engages all 5 of your senses simultaneously. You are seeing the colors of the vegetables change, you are smelling the aromas developing in the pot, you are hearing the sound of things sizzling or bubbling, you are feeling the textures as you chop and stir, and you are tasting and adjusting as you go. This multi-sensory engagement pulls your entire attention into the present moment in a way that a screen simply cannot replicate.
It is almost meditative, actually. When I am cooking something that requires my full attention, I cannot be thinking about my phone, because if I look away for too long, things burn.
Exactly. And this is something that researchers who study mindfulness and attention are very excited about. Many hobbies function as what is called an informal mindfulness practice. You do not have to sit in a meditation pose. You do not have to follow a guided meditation app. The act of deeply engaging in a physical, skill-based activity naturally trains your attention to stay in the present moment, and this present moment awareness is precisely what heavy social media use erodes. When you are always consuming content about other places, other people, other times, you lose the habit of simply being where you are.
I want to make sure we talk about something that I think is really practical for our English learning listeners specifically. Because one of the things that I have found is that hobbies are not just good for your brain in general, they are specifically powerfully good for language learning. Can you talk about that connection?
Absolutely, and this is one of my favorite topics. There is a concept in language acquisition research called comprehensible input in context. What this means is that we learn and retain language most effectively when the words we encounter are connected to real, meaningful experiences. Think about how a child learns language. A child does not sit down with a vocabulary list and memorize the word hot. A child touches a pot on the stove, feels the heat, and hears a parent say hot, no, hot. The word is immediately connected to a sensory experience, an emotional response, a real-world situation, and that connection makes the word stick in the memory in a way that a vocabulary list simply cannot achieve.
So the idea is that if you have a hobby, you're constantly creating those real-world experiences that words can attach to.
Precisely. Let us think about gardening as an example. If you take up gardening as a hobby, you'll naturally encounter an enormous vocabulary in a very organic and memorable way. You will learn words like soil and compost and germinate and prune and weed and harvest and fertilize. And you will not just know these words as abstract symbols on a page. You will know them because you have felt the soil in your hands. You have watched a seed germinate and grow. You have pruned a plant and seen how it responds. The vocabulary is embedded in experience, and that makes it extraordinarily durable in the memory.
That's actually something I've noticed with cooking. My English vocabulary for food and cooking has expanded enormously just from following recipes in English. I had to look up words like simmer and sauté and fold in and blanch, but because I was doing those actions while I learned the words, I never forget them. Whereas if I had just read a list of cooking verbs, I probably would have forgotten them all within a week.
And this points to something that language teachers have understood for a long time, which is that the best language learning is always embedded in meaningful activity. When you are cooking and you encounter a new word, you have a reason to want to understand it. You need to know what blanch means, because if you don't, you might ruin the vegetables. That sense of purpose, that practical need to understand, is one of the most powerful motivators for memory formation.
Let's talk about something that I know many of our listeners probably feel, which is that they want to start a hobby, but they are so burned out from work and from daily life that they genuinely do not feel like they have the energy. They come home at the end of the day feeling completely depleted, and the idea of adding another new thing to their life feels overwhelming. What would you say to someone in that situation?
This is such a common and completely understandable feeling, and I want to address it with a lot of compassion. Because here is the paradox. The people who feel the most burned out and depleted are often the ones who most desperately need a hobby, but they are also the ones who find it hardest to start one. And part of the reason for this is that the brain rot cycle is self-reinforcing. When you feel depleted and exhausted, the last thing you want to do is something that feels difficult. So you reach for the easiest available source of relief, which is your phone. And that passive scrolling makes your brain feel temporarily soothed, but it actually deepens the depletion. So the next day, you feel even more exhausted, even less capable of starting something new.
So how do you break that cycle without it requiring enormous willpower that you simply do not have?
The key is what I call low-stakes entry. The biggest mistake people make when deciding to start a hobby is that they imagine the final version of themselves doing that hobby. They think, I want to learn to paint, and immediately they picture themselves with a professional studio and expensive materials and creating beautiful canvases. And then they look at the gap between where they are and that imagined destination, and it seems impossibly large, so they do nothing. But the low-stakes approach says, forget the destination entirely. Just do the smallest possible version of the thing today.
Can you give some concrete examples of what low-stakes entry might look like?
Of course, if you want to learn to draw, do not buy expensive supplies. Simply take a piece of paper and a pen, and for 5 minutes today, draw the object that is nearest you. Do not judge it, do not compare it to anything, just draw it. If you want to start cooking, do not attempt a complex recipe. Simply make one thing, one dish that has 3 ingredients or fewer. If you want to start learning an instrument, do not worry about scales or music theory. Simply sit with the instrument in your hands for 10 minutes and play any sounds at all, in any order, just to become comfortable with the object. The goal of low-stakes entry is simply to build the habit of showing up, because the habit of showing up is infinitely more valuable than any particular level of skill.
That really reframes it. It takes all the pressure off performance and puts it on presence. You just have to be present with the activity for a short time. You do not have to be good.
Exactly. And what happens over time, if you keep showing up in this low-pressure way, is that you naturally want to do more. You naturally become curious about the next level. The famous psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described this experience as flow. Flow is the state of being completely absorbed in a challenging but manageable activity where you lose track of time and self-consciousness disappears. It is one of the most pleasurable states a human being can experience, and it is only available through active engagement with something challenging. You cannot experience flow while scrolling through social media. The activity is too passive, too easy, too fragmented, but you can experience it while cooking a complex meal, or writing a paragraph in a new language, or playing a piece of music, or building something with your hands.
I have experienced flow while cooking, actually. There have been moments where I looked up and realized an hour and a half had passed and it had felt like 20 minutes, and I felt completely refreshed afterward, not depleted. That never happens to me after an hour and a half of scrolling.
That contrast is so important, and I want our listeners to hold on to it. The contrast between how you feel after passive consumption versus how you feel after active engagement. After scrolling, you feel guilty, depleted, mentally foggy, and vaguely ashamed of how you spent your time. After an engaging hobby session, you feel alive, capable, proud, and energized. Both activities might take the same amount of clock time, but they produce completely opposite effects on your brain chemistry and your sense of self.
Let us turn now specifically to English learning, because I know that's at the heart of why many of our listeners are here with us today. And I want to make the argument, with your help, Anna, that English learning itself is one of the most powerful hobbies a person can take up. Not a subject, not a chore, but a hobby.
I am so glad you raised this, Abel, because this reframe is genuinely life-changing for many learners. And it starts with understanding the difference in your psychological relationship with the activity. When English is a subject, it's something that exists in a classroom or in a textbook or on an exam. It's something that has a right answer and a wrong answer. It's something that you are evaluated on. It's something that can make you feel stupid or slow if you don't progress at the speed that the curriculum demands. That relationship with English is full of anxiety and external pressure.
And that anxiety itself is a barrier to learning. I remember being in English classes in school and being so afraid of making mistakes in front of my classmates that I would sometimes stay silent even when I knew the answer, just in case I was wrong.
This is incredibly common, and it's one of the most damaging effects of treating language as a formal subject rather than a living, playful, exploratory hobby. When English becomes a hobby, everything changes. You're not doing it because you have to, you're doing it because you want to. You explore grammar not because it will be on a test, but because you're genuinely curious about how the language works. You listen to podcasts not to complete an assignment, but because you want to understand what's being said. You watch films and television in English not as homework, but because you enjoy the story and you want to follow it fully.
And when you approach it that way, mistakes become part of the fun rather than a source of shame. When I'm cooking and I add too much salt, I don't feel like a failure. I think, oh, interesting, that's too much. I'll use less next time. And I actually learn more from that mistake than I would from any instruction.
That's a beautiful parallel, and researchers who study language acquisition have found exactly this. Stephen Krashen, a linguist who has spent decades studying how people acquire language, argues that we acquire language most effectively in what he calls a low-anxiety environment, where the learner feels safe to experiment, to make errors, and to focus on meaning rather than form. When English is a hobby that you play with in private, on your own terms, at your own pace, you naturally create a low-anxiety environment for yourself.
I want to talk about some specific ways that English learners can combine a hobby with their language learning, because I think this is incredibly practical. You already mentioned cooking with English recipes. What are some other combinations that work well?
There are so many wonderful combinations, and I think the most important principle is to follow your genuine interest rather than what seems educational. If you are passionate about something, any topic in the world, there is almost certainly a rich community of English speakers talking about it, writing about it, making videos about it. And engaging with that community in English is simultaneously practicing your language and pursuing your passion. So, for example, if you love cycling, you could start reading cycling forums and blogs in English. You could watch English language YouTube channels about bike maintenance and technique. You could follow English-speaking cyclists on social media and read their captions and comments. Suddenly, you are immersed in authentic English in a context that genuinely excites you.
And the vocabulary you learn in that context is going to be incredibly memorable because it is connected to something you care about.
Exactly. And you will also notice something interesting happening. As you become more immersed in the English language community around your hobby, you will start to think about your hobby in English. When you are out on your bicycle and you think about what you want to write or say about the experience later, you will naturally reach for the English vocabulary you have absorbed. This internal thinking in English is one of the most powerful signs of genuine language acquisition. It cannot be forced. It only happens when a language becomes associated with things that genuinely matter to you.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about how hobbies function as an informal mindfulness practice, because I think there is something important there for language learners specifically. Can you say more about attention and how it relates to language learning?
Yes, and this connects directly to the brain rot conversation we started with. One of the most essential skills for language acquisition is sustained attention. When you are listening to a podcast in English, or reading a text in English, or watching a film in English, you need to be able to stay focused on what is happening, to hold multiple pieces of information in your mind simultaneously, to notice patterns, to make connections. All of these skills require a strong, well-trained attention system in the brain.
And heavy social media use, as we discussed, weakens that attention system.
Precisely. So there is a direct relationship between screen addiction and language learning difficulty. Someone who spends 4 or 5 hours a day on passive social media consumption is literally degrading the cognitive tools they need to learn a language. Their working memory, their ability to sustain focus, their patience for ambiguity, all of these are being weakened, and then they sit down to study English and wonder why it feels so hard, why they cannot remember vocabulary, why they cannot follow a conversation at normal speed.
And the hobby is the solution to both problems simultaneously. By taking up an active hobby, you're rebuilding your attention system, and you're also creating an enjoyable context for language learning. It's a two-for-one solution.
Beautifully put. And I want to add one more layer to this, which is about identity, because I believe one of the most powerful things a hobby does is give you an identity. When you take up gardening seriously, you don't just garden, you become a gardener. When you take up cooking seriously, you become a cook. And this identity shift matters enormously for language learning.
Say more about that. I am very curious about the identity aspect.
Research in social psychology shows that behavior change is much more sustainable when it is tied to an identity rather than just a goal. If you say, "My goal is to run 5 kilometers," you will train until you reach that goal and then often stop because the goal is complete. But if you say, "I am a runner," then running is part of who you are, and you continue because stopping would feel like a betrayal of your own self-concept. The same applies to English. If English is just a goal, something you want to achieve, a certificate to put on your resume, you will study until you reach that goal and then stop. But if English becomes part of your identity, if you see yourself as someone who engages with the English-speaking world, who finds joy in the language, who is curious about its expressions and idioms and rhythms, then your relationship with it becomes ongoing and organic.
And a hobby helps you build that identity because it gives you a community. If you're a gardener who engages with English-speaking gardening communities online, you're not just a language student. You're a gardener who happens to use English, and that feels very different.
It feels fundamentally different, and that sense of belonging, of being a genuine member of a community rather than an outsider studying from a textbook, is profoundly motivating. People don't give up on things that are part of who they are. They give up on tasks that feel external and imposed.
I want to make sure we give some very practical, concrete advice to someone who is listening to this right now and thinking, okay, I'm convinced. I want to try this. I'm going to trade some of my scrolling time for hobby time. What should they do this week? What is the very first step?
The very first step is to choose one thing. Not a list of things, not a plan for the next 3 months, just one thing. And to choose it based on genuine curiosity rather than what seems impressive or useful. Ask yourself, is there something I've been quietly curious about for a while, but have never pursued because I thought I was too busy or too old or not talented enough? A lot of people have a small, quiet wish to learn something, to make something, to understand something, and they dismiss it because it doesn't seem practical. But that quiet curiosity is exactly where you should start.
And then?
And then, do the smallest possible version of it this week. Not this month, this week. Spend 15 minutes with it. If it's drawing, draw for 15 minutes. If it's learning basic guitar chords, spend 15 minutes with the instrument. If it's starting to cook more seriously, spend 15 minutes reading a recipe carefully and thinking about each step. Give it 15 minutes of genuine, present attention. Put your phone in another room during those 15 minutes. Not on silent, in another room. Because even the presence of a phone on the table, even if it's face down and silent, has been shown in research to reduce cognitive capacity. Your brain keeps a portion of its attention on the phone, waiting for it to do something.
That's a very specific and important detail. Having the phone out of sight rather than just on silent. I think most people wouldn't think of that.
It seems small, but it is significant. And after 15 minutes of genuine, phone-free engagement with your chosen hobby, notice how you feel. Do not judge the quality of what you produced. Do not compare yourself to experts. Just notice how it feels to have given your full attention to something you chose freely. And then do it again tomorrow, and the day after that. And within 2 weeks, most people find that 15 minutes has naturally expanded to 30 because the activity has started to feel rewarding in itself.
And for English learners specifically, I would add, try to bring English into that hobby space. Even one small English element, one English recipe, one English video about the hobby, one English language forum post that you read. Just one point of connection between your English and your hobby each week.
Yes, and I would also encourage listeners to keep what I call a small observation journal about their hobby, written in English. It does not have to be formal. It does not have to be long. Just 3 or 4 sentences at the end of each session about what you did, what you noticed, what you found difficult, what you want to try next time. This journal serves 2 purposes simultaneously. It gives you a record of your progress in the hobby, which is enormously motivating when you look back over several weeks and see how far you have come, and it gives you a regular, low-pressure writing practice in English, which will improve your vocabulary, your grammar, and your confidence in ways that formal study often cannot.
I love that suggestion. It is such a gentle, pressure-free way to practice English writing without it feeling like homework. You are not being evaluated. You are just recording your own experience for yourself.
And that is the spirit of treating English as a hobby rather than a subject. You are doing it for your own pleasure and growth, on your own terms. There is no external evaluation. There is no grade. There is only the genuine satisfaction of using a language to express something real about your experience.
I want to ask you one final big question before we wrap up our conversation today. We have talked about brain rot, about passive versus active engagement, about dopamine, about neuroplasticity, about hobbies as language learning tools. If you had to summarize the core insight of everything we have discussed today into one idea, one central truth that you would want every listener to carry with them, what would it be?
The core truth for me is this. Your brain is always being shaped by what you give it to do. This is not a metaphor. This is neuroscience. Every hour you spend in passive consumption is an hour that weakens your capacity for attention, for creativity, for sustained effort, and for genuine connection. And every hour you spend in active, engaged, meaningful activity is an hour that literally rebuilds those capacities. You are always choosing, whether consciously or not, what kind of brain you want to have. And a hobby, whether it's cooking or gardening or playing music or learning English, is a daily vote for the kind of brain you want to live in. It's a decision to invest in your own depth, your own capability, your own inner life. And nothing, not a better phone, not a faster internet connection, not a more entertaining algorithm, can give you what that investment gives you. The genuine, durable, deeply human satisfaction of knowing that you made something, learned something, grew into something through your own sustained effort and attention.
That is the exact message I needed to hear, and I believe it is the message our listeners needed to hear today. We spend so much of our modern lives looking for shortcuts, for faster pleasure, for easier entertainment. But the most valuable things in a human life, real skill, genuine creativity, true fluency in a language, deep peace of mind, none of these come quickly, and none of them come passively. They come from showing up day after day with your full attention for something you have chosen because it matters to you. And when English learning becomes one of those chosen things, when you approach it as a hobby that enriches your life rather than a task that burdens it, everything about the experience changes, and the language begins to live inside you in a way that no exam result or grammar exercise could ever produce.